America is, in many ways, the least racist white majority society in the world. I was quite specific in my language. Okay? And I said, if you want to know how far we've gone, just compare this place with a country that's majority people of African origin. It's called Brazil. And so it was happening, but of course, the backlash. But there is no doubt in my mind that we had achieved a considerable degree of success in both moving away from the purely identitarian sort of ethnic chauvinist thing.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le boonga, boonga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le boonga, boonga. Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le boonga, boonga.
So, hello and welcome to BungaCast, the global podcast at the end of history. My name is Alex Gourevitch, and I am a contributing editor, and I'm your host today. I'm hosting here from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Our guest today is Orlando Patterson, the John Cowles Professor of Sociology at Harvard University. Orlando is the leading scholar of the historical sociology of slavery, and he has written widely on race, culture, lynching, Jamaican and American politics, and he is the author of numerous classic works, such as Slavery and Social Death, and Freedom in the Making of Modern Western Culture. He is also the author of a number of novels, including Die the Long Day and my personal favorite, The Absence of Ruins. And he has also had a long career in politics, including working as a special advisor to Michael Manley and having been asked to consult in, remarkably, both the Gerald Ford and the Barack Obama administrations. I'm truly thrilled to have Orlando here. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
My pleasure.
So, Orlando, as you know, the occasion for this interview is the publication of a recent book called The Paradox of Freedom, which is a sort of an interview-based memoir of your intellectual, literary, and political career. And it is probably my favorite thing that I've read in the past couple of years.
Thank you.
Such that I hardly know where to begin. And part of me just wants to ask you biographical questions, because as is sort of laid out in the book, you grew up in Jamaica in a small town called May Pen. Your father was the first black detective in Jamaica, and who was radicalized, as it turns out, by being assigned the task of following Marcus Garvey around and listening to his speeches turned him into a kind of radical nationalist. And then your mother had these extraordinary ambitions for you. She dedicated her life, basically, to ensuring you got the best education, which eventually sent you to the University of the West Indies, then the LSE, where you were part of the early founding of the New Left Review. You were summoned and became acquainted with C.L.R. James. After that, back to Jamaica, Harvard, and so on. However, I will resist the temptation to ask you biographical questions, because for the sake of our audience, I thought what we'd do is start with the scholarship on slavery. Because it seems to me that your scholarship on slavery sort of unifies your personal experiences, your intellectual commitments, and your political concerns. So my first question is really just about your signature understanding of slavery as social death. And as I read it, and as you mentioned in Paradox of Freedom, that this way of thinking about slavery makes it not essentially racial. It's not essentially about exploitation. It is essentially about a special and distinctive social condition. And we can go into the details of it, but just, for our listeners, social death is this condition in which slaves are a member of a dishonored group. They're natally alienated, which is your term, which, as I understand it, means that they have no enforceable claims on society. So they might fall in love, they might empirically have children, but they have no claims themselves or to their kin, which is why the children can be sold, and marriages nullified or never even recognized, and so on. And crucially, social death is a condition of rule by violence, rather than by culture or institution. Now, just to start with, why is this definition of slavery important to you?
Yeah, thanks for having me again. It's important because if you racialize it too much, you miss not only what's critical about it, which is not the racism, although that's important, obviously, but what's central is that condition of isolation, of not belonging, and of having absolutely no rights in a society. And that's an experience shared by all quote-unquote racist ethnic groups all over the world who are slaves. It's important to define it that way too, because American historians, in a kind of disciplinary parochialism, for too long saw the U.S. South as the defining archetypal slavery, when in fact, if you the briefest consideration of comparative data shows that the U.S., if anything, is an outlier. So to use an outlier to define what an institution is, what kind of academic mess you get into. But that, and of course, one of the central features of U.S. slavery was indeed race. But, that's not the case in the ancient world. That wasn't the case in Eastern Europe. That wasn't the case in medieval Europe, and so on. So I found it critical to emphasize this dimension of it because the traditional definitions missed so much that was central to the nature of the relation and the institution, but also miss another critical feature. And again, this has to do with the parochialism of this is Western scholars now rather than American scholars per se. The traditional way of defining it is in legal terms. In the case of the U.S., legal racial term. The slave is the property of another. In the case of America, you also emphasize that just black people only who could be properties of others, but European scholars know that slavery existed in Europe and so on, but they also fell into the the distinctive Western tradition of defining it in legal terms. Now, it's not so much that defining the slave as property is wrong, as that it too narrowly circumscribes slavery in comparative terms, and I'm a comparativist, that this idea of the slave as property, in fact, we know where it originated. It originated in Rome, ancient Rome. And of course, because Roman law was so powerfully influential in the history of Western law, that conception continued. Interestingly, there is one aspect of the West, one region of the West, which was not dominated by Roman law, and that was the Anglo-Saxon and British tradition, common law. Well, common law, there's, as students of the history of law know, as a very different conception of property. Property as a relation, property as something which several people can share, as opposed to something over whom you have absolute dominion, which is the Roman conception. But even in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, the Roman influence was so powerful that they made an exception in defining and talking about slave property, and in fact, from all the slaves, to use the property conception of slavery, which they didn't use in almost all other views of property. So, now there are several interesting aspects of this, by the way. But one thing I want to emphasize is that for the rest of the world, outside of the Roman and Roman legal influence and sphere. Property is not defined in the way in which, slaves are not defined as property, but more importantly, property is not defined in the absolute terms in which the Romans defined it.
Mm-hmm.
Property was relative. It's more like a common law view. Right. Okay? And so for all these reasons, I found that as a comparative sociologist, when I want to look at what was going on in the Middle East, in Islamic world, what is going on in Africa, what is going on in China, what is going on in Korea, right, which had a large-scale slave system for hundreds of years. A lot of people, including Koreans, don't know. You found that definition extremely inadequate. You see, so it's for all these reasons that I said, look, we've got to define it. I want to define it in a way that's meaningful comparatively, which is true both of the U.S. and elsewhere. And this is what comes out. I got it empirically, the idea, from, because I use a grounded theory approach in my studies. But I mean by that, I didn't go into the study of slavery with a hypothesis, a theory of social death.
Right.
I don't work that way. I use a more grounded, what's called a grounded theory approach. I let the data sort of direct where I'm going and then sort of develop my ideas as I move along. And the idea came really, and I want to acknowledge that, out of the French anthropological studies of North Africa, Islamic, North Africa, especially the Tuareg. Mm. Okay? And it was a French anthropologist, Mayassou, and his team, who in studying the Tuareg, found that the Tuareg defined their slaves as socially dead people. Hmm. So it wasn't even that he came up with a theory. It was something that was clearly there in the way in which, and I thought, wow, that's interesting. I mean, and then I started looking at the material from the rest of the world, and I want to emphasize this point because there's a criticism of social deaths that I'm a sociologist, and once people hear you're a sociologist or a historical sociologist, they think you're a theorist, sort of madly going around the world applying your theory to whatever. Mm. And in fact, that wasn't the case. It was my approach, as I said earlier, is very grounded. Mm. And so I didn't impose this idea. Sure. As there's some historian here in the history department here who sort of claims that in a piece he wrote in the American Historical Review. No. It came out from the fact that once this emerged from the data, what's this interesting idea? Mm. Let's look to see if other people have it. And then a group with which I'm very familiar from my historical studies of the Caribbean, which goes all the way back to my undergraduate days, the group you know as the Caribs. They're the Tainos and the Carib groups in the Caribbean, who are the indigenous population. So it's something sort of, it rang a bell. I said, let me go back to the literature on the Caribs, especially the Kalinago. And then you've found they had this strange practice where, because they had a lot of slavery. Mm. They depend heavily on slaves for their wives and so on. But they had this practice where they were very peculiar about haircuts. And haircut, you cut your hair in a certain way when you're in mourning. Mm. Certain style, distinctive. Then I read slaves were forced to permanently cut their hair in the style of mourning. Mm. They were mourning their own death. And so that's how it evolved over and over, all over. You find this idea in the Islamic world and so on. So that's how it came. And then, even in Aristotle and so on, definition, the Greeks' view of them as sort of two-legged animals.
Right.
Even in the Roman view of them being legally dead or a vocal instrument, if you can say,
Right.
So it's emerged empirically.
So I'm glad you sort of mentioned how it emerges empirically out of this comparative study of slavery.
Yes.
In order, partly, one reason for that was to kind of expose the American perspective as exceptional.
Yes.
And another feature of your thinking about slavery, it seemed to me, was also to help direct our attention to other aspects of the legacy of slavery.
Right.
In particular, that the especially violent character of slavery seems to me, when I read your work, especially important, not just in itself for understanding slavery, but for really understanding some of its legacies.
Right.
So I wonder, and in particular because rule by violence is an alternative to the creating of forms of rule that are institutionalized.
Right.
So I wonder if you could say, what is it about slavery, in your mind, that makes it essentially violent?
Yes.
And how does that sort of contribute to, even today, in your mind, to how we understand certain features of slavery's historical legacy?
Right. Glad you asked that, because just a little preamble to that. There's a real problem in historiography where, of course, we study the oppressed, the subaltern, and their history, and so on. But we are often reluctant to recognize certain aspects of oppression and what oppression does to the oppressed. So the fact that slavery is fundamentally a violent institution is, it's recognized in one of the mythologies, which is partly based on history, partly on myth. But the traditional view of why slaves existed all over the world, but you get it in Locke, you get it in Hobbes, but it's also just a traditional view. Is especially in free, quote unquote, societies which celebrate their freedom, how come some people are slaves? And the traditional explanation is that slaves are essentially the product of warfare. They're people who were in conflict with you, or their ancestors were.
Right.
They were defeated. They should have been killed, as defeated people were. Right. But they choose, since you make it, the mythology makes it as a choice. They had a fateful choice: death or honor. Yeah. You're going to, or sort of life or honor, I should say. So are you going to choose death with honor, or are you going to choose life with permanent dishonor? And that's the explanation offered in the mythology of so many people, that the slave was someone who should have died, who was an enemy, and who fought your ancestors, and who should have been killed. So you find it in Locke. I mean, even Locke fell for that, because Locke was desperate for something to explain why it is that he, one of the forefathers of political theory of freedom, wrote the Constitution of Carolina, which begins with justifying slavery. Anyway, sure, you can justify it if that was there. So, but the fact is that, so it was seen as originating in violence, and because the slave, in a sense, did not belong to the society and had no claims in it, he belonged to the owner and could be treated in any way the owner wished. Now, owners may be benign and choose not to be very abusive, but in every society, it was felt that the slave had to be punished punishment was because who wants to be a slave? In a way, implicit in the idea that you needed violence is a recognition that the slave, in his or her humanness, does not want to be a slave. Right. So there is interesting, even though you may, there's a contradiction you often get, so the fact that the slave is degraded and so on, and they love their slavery, as the Southerners would like to say. But at the same time, the fact that they had to punish them meant that they obviously didn't want to. And you get in the sort of the mythos of enslavement everywhere, that the slave was lazy, the slave shirked work, that they lied, and so on. And in a way, that's a recognition of the fact that they did not want it, that they resisted. They would want to resist if they weren't punished. So violence was necessary. So even in the most benign of masters who may be reluctant to use the whip, nonetheless felt that it was an essential component because it was an institution born in violence. It was an institution which the slave inherently hated, loathed, and therefore the only way to keep them in that condition is either through violence or the threat of violence. And that's everywhere.
This is fascinating, and I want to, at some point, sort of follow up with how you think that ends up affecting post-emancipation family structure, work ethic, things like that. I mean, I know that we could spend 3 hours talking about that, but just as your...
Wait, I want to say something about that, because how does... Anyway, just think about it. This is a very abnormal, inhuman and inhumane relationship. The fact that you did not own or possess your children, you had no rights to them, you had no rights or sense of possession to your parents or your ancestors. I call it a genealogical isolate. But that then, what that creates is a situation in which, if you have nothing to live for or look forward to, one unfortunate effect on that is to live in the moment or to resist. Every society has traditions of resistance, one form or the other, and I sort of spent quite a bit of time writing on this violent resistance. So the owner often have legitimate reasons in many societies, not all of them, for making violence central, his own fear of being killed.
Right.
And some societies have far more greater tradition of resistance than others. So it was seen, the owners themselves saw the situation as an inherently violent one, not just to get the slave to work for you, but also the need to resist their own violence, because they always, the fear that the slave always potentially, once he had the opportunity, would want to resist either through murder or through rebellion and so on. And that, now, the question, all of that is acceptable to the historiography of slavery, and there's a lot of work on slave revolts and, day-to-day resistance in slavery, to as well as both violent resistance and non-violent resistance. But what happens especially when in the normal day-to-day course of interaction among slaves themselves, what tends to happen in slave society is a dismal hierarchy of control and sort of command and vulnerability. the vulnerable in slave societies are abused by those who are less vulnerable, and every form of authority is seen as based on violence and beating, because or the threat of beating, because even when it's not necessarily. Even when a slave is not resisting, you'll find in the cane fields in the Caribbean or in Mississippi, in the cotton fields, the people are out there with the whip. So the symbol of violence is always there, even if no one is immediately. So it is seen what emerged from that situation after decades of years, hundreds of years. It was seen that any form of authority requires violence. Now, that is quite clear in the most powerful authority, and they're there with the whip even when you're not resisting, to induce anyone to do anything against their will or even requires the threat of violence. Now, inevitably, that gets carried over in relations among slaves themselves, because there was the vulnerable among children. So, are the most vulnerable. So, how do you bring up children? By beating them in the same way that you get beaten in the fields if you don't do what is told. The threat of the lash is always there, and the use of violence in bringing children up is always. That's reinforced, of course, by fundamentalist Christianity, which is taught to the slaves, don't spare the rod and spoil the child. But even in non-Christian contexts, you get that situation that, anyone who is under you must be held in fear of your retaliation if they don't obey. It also applies to relationship between men. The different sort of, people they're always going to be more powerful individuals, leaders in communities. But it also applies in terms of intimate relations, male-female relationships. So even in non-slave societies, of course, women are vulnerable, and many societies, men are expected to have the right to punish their wives, even without slavery. In a society with slavery, where that is the norm, you can imagine it's even more so the case, especially if you yourself have sort of, deep feelings of humiliation from your relationship with those above you. So you get a hierarchy of punishment and abuse. And it messes up relationships very badly. That's the part of the story which sort of nationalistic or historians are too heavily into identity, but rather not talk about.
Well, yes, no, there's so much in there, Orlando, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because it sort of facilitates the transition I wanted to make here from slavery to ethnic politics.
Yeah.
So, I wish we had more time to really go into that. Here's one thing that comes out in Paradox of Freedom, which is really a general question I have, which is, do you think we're still mired in a politics of ethnic chauvinism? So, let me sort of just give you a sense of why I'm asking that question. So, you say in the book that one reason that the social death concept mattered to you, and these arguments about violence and the legacy of violence mattered to you, was that you felt that those who wanted to make slavery essentially racial were somehow part of the rise of a black and white ethnic politics in the 1970s, 60s and 70s. And that's the period after you've written these books about the sociology of slavery when you've turned to writing more directly about what you call ethnic chauvinism. And what we have come to call identity politics, I think. And you're even invited, there's an interesting anecdote about how you're even invited by Nathan Glazer, I believe it is, to the Ford White House to debate Gerald Ford and these other Harvard intellectuals, Moynihan and Glazer, about whether Ford should embrace white ethnicity.
Yeah.
And you argue vigorously against it and lose. And this part of the interview was so fascinating to me because so much of what you said sounded so familiar. I suddenly felt like there'd been no progress in 50 years, no social progress in 50 years in thinking about these matters. It was really a stark moment. I kind of put the book down. It was a strange, just so strange to read it. So could you say first what you mean by ethnic chauvinism and why you were turned to writing about it then? Because you've already given us a taste of your conflict with the nationalists. And maybe say a little bit about how you think these issues have or haven't changed since the 1970s.
Yes. So I had, you have to see my background. I'm coming out of, first of all, New Left Britain, sort of Marxian, sort of neo-Marxian sort of tradition, J.L.R. James, that's more neo-Trotsky, more generally neo-Hegelian tradition, and then Caribbean, sort of anti-later post-colonial neo-Marxian sort of tradition, right? Mm-hmm. In which ethnic politics was simply strongly discouraged. I mean, for ideological reasons, for other reasons. It's striking, in the Jamaica, there are several attempts at racializing the politics. It's never worked. Because it's not just the intellectuals. Jamaicans themselves don't buy it very much, even though they're very proud. As Jamaicans, their dreadlocks were discovered. It's a country of Rastafarians, so you can celebrate your blackness and be proud of your blackness. But sort of making it the basis of political identity is seen as a no-no. So that was a tradition which I came out of, and I landed in America in 1970. Right in the beginnings of the so-called ethnic revival. Yeah. Now, that ethnic revival was in part a response to and allied with the black sort of civil rights movement, which had taken, just about when I came, had taken a turn towards more sort of identitarian sort of politics. From Black Power. Black Power was, very much still an aggressive sort of vigilant sort of neo-socialist sort of position. And the emphasis on power, more the power than in the blackness. I remember talking to Stokely Carmichael when he visited LSE, and also Malcolm X, who also visited LSE when I was teaching there, and Malcolm X was quite clear on this too. So then we had the white ethnic revival, and I thought, this is dangerous. This could backfire so easily, and the climax of this was. There's a moment, this is before your time, when Jimmy Carter was campaigning, and one of his biggest blunders, poor Jimmy Carter, he misunderstood the whole thing. He gave a speech in which he said, "I believe in the sanctity of ethnic neighborhoods." And everybody suddenly said, wait a minute, what's going on? But poor Jimmy Carter was just picking up on the ethnic revival, singing, saying, sanctity, ethnic neighborhood. It was one of those moments where everybody thought, hey, wait a minute. But this is where it's all leading to. But I turned to him and said, well, of course this is where it leads to. What the hell do you think? But, my colleague and Moynihan and others were, of course, very much at the forefront of this, the text on ethnicity was written, on white ethnicity was written by them, of course, Beyond the Melting Pot. I'm in dialogue with them. I must say, Not was a great guy, we disagreed, but he's one of the nicest person to disagree with. Yep. Because he was saying, Orlando, you got to understand what was going on before the denial of Jewishness and integration, assimilation, and so on. So I could see what he was getting at. That's, for the first time outwardly we can, not only resist sort of ordinances which sort of say you can't sell to Jewish people your home and so on. That part of it they felt they had won, but say, hey, we're proud of being Jewish and so on. We're proud of being Irish and so on. And okay, but how far does this take you? And when Jimmy Carter started talking about the sanctity of ethnic neighborhood, everybody scratched their head. It was a scratch your head moment.
Yeah.
And that's when I decided, I got to write a book on this subject because this could get dangerous.
Yeah.
I saw that.
Yeah.
And Carter survived that. So he won just about, but then he lost the election to Reagan. But by then, of course, it went rampant. And I saw it as having negative effects. I felt it could turn against blacks. Now, in a way, by prediction, it took, 50 years? Because, as bad as he was, Reagan, he wasn't a racist, and he did things which weren't good for black people, but the outward race, he didn't overturn the Voting Rights Act, although he didn't like it. But of course, we're in a situation now where what's happening right now with Trump. Trump is using a form of white ethnic identity against black people. He's saying, he's saying he's turning the civil rights movement against it. He's saying that there's bias against whites, and he's using the Civil Rights Act to promote, all kind of anti-black. Yeah. That's precisely what I saw happening eventually. This sort of thing can always backfire and to turn against you. And it's happening right now as we speak, no?
So is one of your thoughts that there's no way to do ethnic politics without some underlying notion of ethnic purity?
Yeah. So my view on it
that's like
is,
the danger.
Yeah, there's always that danger. I think it can be seen as a political experience. A minority group which has been, persecuted, experienced genocide and so on, has to mobilize. Right. So that's why, I was sympathetic. I mean, we could have a whole other session on this. I was very intrigued by the whole Jewish history and so on, and had many wonderful discussions with one of my mentors, Daniel Bell. Yeah. Who sort of always, Daniel, this huge library, sort of, all his classic books. You got to read this, and so on. Reading the history of Zionism and so on. So, if you face genocidal risk, of course you got to mobilize on the basis of your ethnic identity, right? And the whole thing, I almost did. I was so intrigued by the whole phenomenon that I almost did my dissertation on that. But I decided against it, wrote the book later on. But I had many sort of very lively debates with Nat and with Dan. Of course, one of the people who strongly supported ethnic chauvinism book was one of my main mentors was David Reisman. Mm-hmm. David belonged to that tradition of very concerned about identity politics among Jews and others. And so the book Ethnic Chauvinism was dedicated to David and Evie.
I see.
Who read it line by line. And it was sort of
it's so interesting to me that these are that your interlocutors to this point are all Jewish sociologists.
Yeah.
And that in the background is that thought. I hadn't in the book that isn't clear. You're thinking about sort of black nationalism and then the white reaction.
I generalized. I was looking at it more generally. It's sort of the nature of ethnic politics, where white was so necessary at certain points. You had to. It's the 1960s. You had to mobilize on ethnic terms. So how do you do that? You do it, of course, having political alliances with non-identity people, with whites and others, Jews and others in the civil rights movement. So it did not become.
Right.
It had to be. It's a fascinating alliances resolve the problem of not becoming identitarian. Those powerful alliances between blacks and Jews and liberal whites and others, and women later on. So that dissipated any push towards chauvinism.
I see. So is your feeling, so is that one of the things you think's changed then? Is that in that period, there's still a universal horizon within which different groups understand their fate is linked to the fate of other groups, all struggling for the same rights, whereas now it's just a...
The identitarian thing, oh my God. Last night, I was looking at PBS News. And they have these nice little segments. So they had a segment on an interesting, curious group of an artist colony up in Maine. Devoted primarily to black art, black and other ethnic groups. Now, they had this long interview with this black artist couple who were going on about their art, and it's all about finding and discovering and celebrating blackness. And then they said this. So the guy said, "You know what? Maine is the whitest state in America. Why are you up here?" and he didn't quite pass it that way, but that's how it came out. And then he said, "Well, they virtually said we came here, and we our blackness became even more important to us because we were isolated." And I thought, there's something weird going that you should be going out of your way to find him, and that you should go to Maine and to intensify your awareness of your blackness. And I thought, this has gotten completely out of hand. This is no longer a political thing. This is one in which you're sort of focusing overwhelmingly on your blackness, your identity as race, and neglecting everything else, which every other artist should be emphasizing, which is your humanness, And so that's when I start getting into trouble,
So I hear that, and one other thing that sort of occurred to me reading Paradox of Freedom was that in the 70s and 80s and even 90s, your concern with ethnic chauvinism is on the one hand that it turns into this sort of project of ethno-racial purity.
Right, yeah.
And on the other, it's actually the way in which sort of white liberal society takes it up in this sort of way that's patronizing.
That's right. That's right.
While today, I was trying to think, what's different today? And if I had to put it in sort of stark terms, it seems like maybe up until sort of Trump really politicized white ethnicity a certain way, there's a way, the way of thinking about this ethnicity was less in terms of the kind of distinctive, positive political project of a racially pure group, and more in terms of ethnicity as different victim groups. And I'm wondering if it's sort of this is why then people seek out some kind of experience where you suddenly feel like the minority, because it's only in the experience of being a victim that that you are part of the group, and then this leads to the mutual the inability to then see what you might share.
Exactly, you're absolutely right in that. That's where it leads, because and there was a moment in which it seemed to be sort of working in the right direction, in the sense that people are emphasizing less and less the identitarian thing in racial terms, and more identity as a sort of what we have in common, whether as an oppressed group or as liberals or democratic socialists or whatever you want. You can come at it, but in different ways, and in which you sort of see ethnicity as more a kind of a familiar thing which you enjoy and which you invite others to enjoy with you, and so on. Okay, that was happening. That was happening, And in a way, and this is where again I get into some problems. In a way, that is happening in the overarching culture. Now you have many different cultures in any society, and in America certainly, regional cultures, different groups, and so on, and overlapping cultural phenomenon. But you get it. You certainly found a situation in which people could enjoy the fruits of people's celebration, sort of non-agonistic celebration of their identity and the cultural products thereof. And of course, for me, the quintessential cultural product of that experience is jazz, but also popular music. And so, I mean, in America and sports. Right. So America, it was happening. It is happening in America. I mean, you look at what does your sort of average take away from once he leaves his work, goes home, he sits down, and he's looking at a national sporting event, which is overwhelmingly a joint product between blacks and whites and so on. And you get it when they go to dance, you get it. So it is happening. It is happening, and so unfortunately, one could just have a long analysis of what Trump did in terms of the reaction of the white chauvinists to precisely this, that this was succeeding, especially among the younger generation of people. I can say, I have a second family. I have a youngish daughter. She's Gen Z. I know all about Gen Z. I'm in my 80s because I have a daughter who's Gen Z. And see, the sort of things they just take for granted. Right. So I just want to emphasize, America did succeed to a remarkable degree. And I make a statement which conservatives have picked up, and critics, I don't know how many critics have found it yet, but several conservatives have found the remark. And I pointed out, I said, look, and this was made, I think, during Obama's I said, look, it's not just the fact that we have a black president, but that America is, in many ways, the least racist white majority society in the world. I was quite specific in my language. Okay? And I said, if you want to know how far we've gone, just compare this place with a country that's majority people of African origin. It's called Brazil. And so it was happening. But of course, the backlash, and we can spend a lot of time talking about what happened there and why that. I cannot help feeling that while part of the backlash is the sort of populist, riding the populist wave, and the political scientists really, that's all they're talking about now. Is it economics or is it racial and reaction or what? Is both, obviously. But there is no doubt in my mind that we had achieved a considerable degree of success in both moving away from the purely identitarian sort of ethnic chauvinist thing. I guess Obama may have been the culmination of that. This isn't to say that, then you get this crazy thing about, racism was over. And no one is saying that. Obviously, clearly you walk around America, you'll still see racism. But that in terms of the movement, away from both the purely sort of chauvinistic identitarian policy among both whites, as in the 70s, and blacks, was happening. And then there's just been this incredible reaction. And we're living through it now. We're living in an authoritarian state, but that's something else. But I tie it up with the failures, perhaps. Some of the failures of the movement, which just I think fail to see the dangers involved. Let me just leave it at that, okay?
Maybe this is an opportunity to think about the politics of freedom, because I wonder if you think that one of the failures of the earlier politics of ethnic chauvinism was that in some way it's a deficient way to express and articulate a politics of freedom.
Of freedom.
And this is sort of, just, for the listeners, the first book of yours I ever read was actually Freedom in the Making of Modern Western Culture. And I read that and I thought, oh my God, who is this guy? And then I went and read everything else.
Yeah, thank you.
And it's an extraordinary book. I recommend it to everybody listening. And one thing that's important to you in that book is to say that freedom as a value, not just as something people talk about, but as something that's institutionalized, a practice. So it's a principle that organizes our social practices, has these lowly origins, a low pedigree, as it were, because it originates in slavery and the slave's desire to articulate and live in freedom. So it's not that it's a product of the top, but somehow comes from the bottom. And you say this sort of sets in motion, in particular, a kind of modern politics of freedom.
Yes.
And at the same time, so much of your scholarship, which you just talked about today, is also about how the experiences of enslavement kind of leave their marks and carry over decades. Yeah. And I wonder for you, how do these things connect? So on the one hand, the special origins of the practice of freedom and slavery among those who are enslaved who demand freedom. And then on the other hand, the sort of special constraints and inhibitions of those who inherit the wounds of oppression.
Yeah, you see clearly where I come from, in Jamaica, which there are few more societies freedom-loving. No, as you know, Jamaica has one of the highest tradition of slave rebellion, fight for freedom. And in fact, the British abolition of slavery, they were wrangling about it in Parliament in 1933. They kept going back and forth to pass the Abolition Act. And it was a slave revolt, a Christmas rebellion of 1832 by Daddy Sharp, which was island-wide, one of the greatest slave revolts of all time. That finally scared the hell out of the British and said, well, the party is over. Let's go with it, and pass the Abolition Act. So that tradition is there, and that tradition never went away. 30 years after slavery was abolished, the peasants said, we need land. What the hell has got? Freedom must mean the freedom to support yourself. And they went and revolt again in 65. So there's a long tradition of freedom, meaning self-sufficiency, meaning the power to do what you want to do as long as you don't mess with other people. And it also means political sort of, control and so on. It was always there, but there was the personal dimension. So there's the political and the personal dimension, the interaction, the interrelationships, and so on, which sort of came from slavery. Now, one interesting way in which people found to deal with the violence in relationships. And, the one reason I can talk about it openly, which most Black Americans don't want to talk about this. Now, I can talk about it because it's the only thing people talk about in Jamaica.
Right.
If you go to Jamaica and you read the letters to the editor, it's at least there's never a day pass in which people aren't commenting on the violence in relationships and that it goes back to slavery. So this is just the norm. People were aware of it. Now, one way in which you deal with it, there are several ways in which you deal with it, okay? And we also discuss publicly ways in which you deal. One, of course, way is through religion. The religious path, God is love, and so on and so forth. And the peasants, they, did develop their own sort of view of this, and it didn't work entirely because the violence still persisted, and because Christianity itself, encouraged this business of don't spoil the rod and spoil it, don't spoil it, spare the rod and spoil the child, and so you did get the violence continuing in parent-children relationship and to some extent male-female relationship, but it did mute it a lot, and there was sort of the church, the community, and the rest of it. The other way in which, and there was another religion, and the other way is through a sort of the Black culture, the African heritage as one of love and so on. The wonderful thing about the Rastafarians is that they brought two together. They brought religion and they brought this sort of cultural aspect of love and fellowship together in the creed. So brother man and peace and love is the peace and love, peace and love, and brethren and brotherhood and loving yourself and loving the way you look. Now, that was the kind of positive racial sort of identity, which was not sort of identitarian in the sense that it was setting you up in relation to someone else. Because the Rastas, in fact, for a long time would have nothing to do with politics and resisted strongly any attempt to use them, use their faith as a way of mobilizing politically. But it was one important way in which, and they tell you that one of the roles of the creed is say, we don't have violence among ourselves is one way of dealing. So you do get a constant struggle, but there's awareness of the inherited violence in male-female relationship, in male-male relationship, and in parent-child relationship, and the need to deal with it. And there are all these ways. Now, and one of the problems at Jamaica is that many of the traditional mechanisms dealing with it, the peasant way was eroded as people moved to the city. The religious way was eroded as people became more secular. And if you didn't join the Rasta movement, there was the two main ways of dealing with what everybody recognized as a propensity to violence in the society which we inherited. Any schoolboy or schoolgirl will tell you that's where it's coming from. It's openly discussed. So rather than being seen as hush, something you don't talk about because you're spoiling the narrative. The narrative, the good part of the narrative is resistance and resilience. We all know about that, as well as all the wonderful things that Black people create, the music and all the rest of it. But you don't talk about that side of it. Well, in the Caribbean, that's not the case. I mean, they talk about both sides. And so that's where I get into trouble in trying to talk about it in that way here.
So that's so interesting you brought that up, because one thing that really came through in the book is that it seems to matter to you a lot that social movements be self-critical.
Right.
And that I guess maybe one problem with ethnic politics or identitarianism is that it gets in the way of any capacity for self-critique. And one reason it seems to you to matter that social movements be self-critical is that there's some changes that only those who have suffered or inherited oppression can make for themselves. Right. So you have this phrase, for instance, inward-looking social movements, that if you've inherited these ways of thinking about violence or family structure or the work ethic, there's only they can transform themselves. And it's a fascinating, and I can see why it gets you in trouble. And I'm curious how you would respond to a certain kind of critic who says, well, this is too demanding. I mean, the idea that people can just sort of change their family structures. Yeah. What about wider social responsibility? What about the wider social injustices that people face? Tell me.
The structure. Well, just to point out that I'm not the only one. There's a Jamaican far more famous than I am, and it's far more influential in Jamaica. It's called Bob Marley. Yeah. and he's most famous. He's a saint in Jamaica. In fact, right now the discussion is: are we going to make him a national hero with a statue of up there among with the gods?
I'm surprised that hasn't been done already.
But his most famous song, Redemption Song,
Right.
only yourself can free your mind.
Right.
Just direct, outward.
Yeah.
Okay? That's a redemption song. Only you can free. Get yourself over mental slavery. You could listen to the words of that song.
Believe me, I remember.
This
I know
is what I'm coming out of. I mean, Marley and myself were roughly the same age. Lassie died in his early 30s, mid-30s. But that, if you listen to his songs, he is saying that. But the most famous, and by the way, just as an aside, when I won the Hegel Prize, they had this big concert in the Stuttgart town hall, and they hired a wonderful young German composer to compose a song for the occasion, a tune for the occasion.
This is just last year.
This is just last December. Yeah. And what she did was she had a classical rendering of Redemption Song.
Wow. Did it work? Did it work?
Beautiful piano, for the piano. Wow. Anyway, but so if anyone listening thinks that this is me being sort of just an isolated voice, I said just listen to Bob Marley, please. But so who says in song everything I've been saying here, and all the things that slavery did, mental slavery calls it, and the need, but only you can do it. You gotta. Okay, so that's my authority.
Yeah.
But okay. The big problem, I tell you. I don't want to sound unsympathetic. I am not. I live here. I see myself as a Black American, and I understand. I've got Black American children. I understand the big difference between America and the Caribbean is, of course, what one may call the white gaze. And I think that explains a lot about why it's so hard to move towards the position I'm, because not that people don't see. I think the Afrocentricists, what they call themselves, they
Afro-pessimists.
Afro-pessimists, I think they kind of see it. But it's hard to get there. I mean, it's hard to get away from the white gaze. Now, for me, it's very easy. I get on, I use my miles and get on JetBlue and I fly to Jamaica, and in 3 hours and 40 minutes, I'm out of the white gaze. So I understand why it becomes very difficult for people to, but you have to. This is the challenge. This is the real challenge, and people have been struggling with this. And I mean, in a funny kind of way, the Afro-pessimists are trying to acknowledge the persistence of slavery and social death. They've grabbed the concept, they've made it their own, they've interpreted it their way. But in a way, they're acknowledging it. I don't know where it's going to lead to, but my own sense is that, look, let's get into, for a second, what's happening right now. We're in an authoritarian phase. We're not going towards an authoritarian, so we're in an authoritarian society. It's been justified, and it's partly, it's not partly, it's used and abused in a horrible way. The whole sort of previous movement at ethnic and racial liberation as its foundation. That's what it did. It's going right back to the civil rights law acts. Yeah. The question which we've got to ask is, what do we do about this?
Yeah.
Because it was an opening which they've made use of. And the question we got to ask is, where do we go from here with this, which offers, the right, the populist, the chauvinistic, the racist right, the opportunity to mobilize.
Mm.
And then, how can we sort of march forward? I mean, a movement towards equality, which is still too far away, without providing this context,
right,
which these bastards exploited and used as a basis for their mobilization.
right.
We got to start thinking. I don't hear people thinking about that, because if you have to be careful how you say this, because people say, "Are you saying that what they do is right?" Of course not. They're a bunch of fucking racists. What I'm saying is,
Right.
they were able to mobilize,
Right.
on this basis, and what are we going to do about it?
So can I ask you a question about that then? Which is, there's always a temptation in these situations to kind of defend what they're attacking.
Yes.
But reading your work, the interview, some of the things you said, what you were mentioning about the white gaze, it seems like there's also, you have this sort of, maybe it's too facile to say a pox on both your houses, but you have these arresting positions against the way, like, sort of liberal white society takes up identity politics. So there's a passage, if you let me read you back to yourself, but which stood out to me, which is, you say, "I saw a wishy-washy kind of liberal guilt thing that I felt was not good for blacks. And I saw the black identity movement, especially the middle class, playing into that, and I didn't like that. I was for a tough-minded facing of the role of class in black life, the way Martin Luther King Jr. was going toward the end of his life." And you say this is something you're thinking in the 70s and
right,
early 80s.
Right.
Now, and you say this is a bit of your quote lingering left orientation, and if I understand what you're saying there correctly, it would be a mistake to go back to this, to try the kind of sympathetic liberal white. That's another version of the white gaze.
Yeah.
In which case, it's a mistake in the current context to react by kind of defending, I guess, what you see as a kind of patronizing, uncritical disposition towards minorities. But then, I hate the kind of so what's your prescription? But in terms of when you look around and think, so what are the prospects for an actual politics of freedom today? Or what's promising to you? Do you see something, or do you think this is just one of these periods of reaction you have to kind of weather through, and the thing is just to not get sucked into kind of uncritical knee-jerk defense of the what came before?
Look, radical coalition politics. I'm for Bernie, and that's where a younger version maybe. I don't know if I'd call it democratic socialism, because I'm realistic. What word? But that's not what it is. There is the opportunity is there for radical coalition, non-identitarian politics, which non-identitarian doesn't mean you're neglecting your blackness or your Jewishness or so. Okay, but that's something you do.
Yeah.
That's your cultural thing, and so we can come and share it and all the rest of it. But it's a tough-minded a coalition. Now people have learned. Now we thought the Democratic Party thought it had that, and that it was becoming the majority party with the coalition of the various groups, the sort of Latino minorities and Jewish and Black, as well as the younger generation of whites, sort of. That seemed, for a while, I believe that, I thought, we were heading in the right. And that didn't work. And the question is why. I've been trying to figure that one out. There's some naivety, partly in identity, naive identity thinking about quote unquote Latinos A significant number of whom are fundamentally conservative people. I mean, but the important thing is that seeing them as a single group is just not, was just wrong. I mean, sociologically, politically, there's a lot of mistakes were made in that regard. But the potential is there, especially, in terms of post-Trump. He's made, if you're too foolish to see that Trump is just, hoodwinking you, the Latino population, but making there's an ironic twist. There are many twists to what's going on right now. Mm. But one of them, and I started writing an op-ed on it, but sorry, it was going to be too provocative, so I didn't. But one of them was, having written on not just slavery, but also on the post-slavery fascist period, in many ways, the closest thing to a genocidal period in America, which is the Jim Crow era,
right,
in which being black was the marker.
Yeah.
To be hunted down and lynched or imprisoned. I'm looking and I suddenly said, oh my God, this is happening. Except if you look Latino and working class, you're being, it's like the old sort of Jim Crow South. That's what they're doing. That's what ICE is doing. Yeah. The ICE is like the lynchers.
But here's still one puzzle about that. I'm curious, you're thinking about this, Orlando, because the strange thing is that Trump won on a cross-racial electoral coalition. I mean, in some ways, he seems to prove the possibility you can win this way.
Yes.
So how do you, unlike Jim Crow, where it's come to power with racial white voting bloc, here there's something a little bit stranger, more contradictory about Trump, no?
Trump is a contradiction in many ways because he's a racist. There's no doubt about it. I mean, he has dinner with sort of, white supremacists, right. But at the same time, he had blacks and a substantial number of Latino. We lost Wisconsin because of the Latino vote. We lost Florida. I mean, there was a time when, I'm teaching on the Caribbean, and I say huge numbers of Puerto Ricans have moved to Florida. I said, we have hundreds of thousands of them. And I thought, Jesus, Florida is going back Democratic. It didn't happen. And so I said the political scientists are really, their head is into this heavily now. Is it politics? Is it economics? Is it, it's partly a failure to recognize, that people's economic interests or their perception of their economic interests may sometimes transcend their ethnic interests. We had a simple-minded kind of view of ethnic coalition.
Right.
That, it was not only the fact that there's no single thing called the Latino population, but more importantly, that ethnic interests sometimes take second place to economic and class interests. So there's a lot of failure, a simplistic thinking about that. I think a sort of, a tough-minded coalition politics, which recognizes, the dangers of a simple-minded kind of ethnic coalition. When I talk about coalition politics, I'm talking about is on the basis of economic interests. I see. Basically, and that's there. Right. We're getting screwed. And, and the populist mythology about bringing back industrial jobs is just ridiculous. People are going to eventually find that. Okay? And the factories are closing down. And the times that are long peace and Montana and the sort of the closing down of Trump's ideal kind of factory, the wood working factory. So it's the possibilities are there, but we have to be careful how we play this coalition game, and it can't be on the basis of just ethnic coalition. That's not going to work. Talk about coalition of the kind which I think we need some younger Bernies. I think Bernie sees it quite clearly. Sanders, and I'm not going to call it, America is just too capitalistic to ever accept the word socialism. it's a kind of bad word, you know. I don't. God bless him. I mean, you know, this young man in New York. It'll be fascinating to see what happens there. But you know, social democracy works well enough, you know, and but you need a tough-minded sort of coalition politics, which I think is possible, and Trump is making it more and more possible every day. But with the clear what's happening, what ICE is doing, so that the idea that you can ever really trust Republicans again, I mean, Jesus, I mean, I don't know, anyone could be so stupid. I mean, I doubt that they are. And so the post-Trump thing is going to be very interesting, right? And I'm waiting for a kind of, not just a post-Trump, but a post-ethnic kind of politics to emerge out of the reaction and the suffering and the humiliation that people, you know, of all ethnicities have gone through, but especially the Latino and Black populations, and also what's happening too with the Jews were a very important part of that earlier coalition, and the cynical way, as you know, anti-Semitism is being used. It's just outrageous, and I don't know how sensible people can buy into this. It's outrageous, and you know, I for some reason, maybe because I've spoken to the Hillel group a couple of times and so on, I'm on the list, sir, of Harvard's rabbi. So he sends me his newsletter every week. But you know, I really think that I'm surprised that he and others, and I'm just trying to think when I should sort of write and say, look, you got to say something about the way in which anti-Semitism is being abused, and because there's going to be a backlash against this, which may be terrible.
Exactly.
The post-Trump reckoning is going to be very interesting, and I'm waiting for that because I think it's an opening. It's an opening, right?
I agree.
Assuming we survive.
Well, thank you, Orlando. This has been a phenomenal interview. I wish we could do about 4 or 5 more hours of it. Thank you.
That's great. Oh, that's good. That's good.